Hello and welcome. So let's start with a really big idea. A nation, it isn't just a bunch of lines on a map, right? Or just a passport. It's actually something we build together inside our own minds. It's this incredibly powerful story that we all kind of agree to believe in. It's that feeling of connection we have with millions and millions of people we will never ever meet. You know, the writer V.S. Naipaul just nailed this feeling. When he arrived in England, he was expecting to find the place he had built up from stories, from books, basically from a shared fantasy. And this quote, it gets right to the heart of what we're talking about today. The nation as this deeply personal, imagined creation. Okay, let's have some fun with this. What's the invisible thread that connects, say, the super idealized world of Downton Abbey with the rugged American cowboy? Or a viral TikTok trend that celebrates British life with the story of Betsy Ross sewing the first American flag? Well, the answer is that they are all these powerful cultural stories that help build a shared sense of we. And that leads us right to our big question for this explainer. Now, for all of you studying the Anglais Monde Contemporain program, this is a perfect fit for our theme of identities and exchanges, and even more specifically, our axis of study, imagined worlds and representations. To get to the bottom of this, we're going to follow a simple two-part plan. First, we'll look at how these identities get built, and second, how they're being challenged in the world today. So, to tackle our question, we need a key intellectual tool. And that tool comes from the historian and political scientist Benedict Anderson and his hugely influential theory of imagined communities. It's an amazing way to understand nationalism, not just as a political ideology, but as a cultural system. Okay, so here's the formal definition from Anderson's work back in 1983. He argued that a nation is imagined because, think about it, even in the smallest nation on Earth, nobody can ever know, meet, or even hear of all their fellow citizens. And yet, in the minds of every single person lives this image of their connection, of their communion. Let's put that way more simply. It's that feeling of solidarity you might get during the Olympics or the World Cup, right? It's the we you feel with millions of complete strangers. Now, this connection isn't random. Oh, no. It is carefully built, constructed through a shared landscape of stories, symbols, and memories that we all consume. All right, let's move into part one and see exactly how this whole thing works in practice. We're going to look at these specific cultural tools that the United Kingdom and the United States have used throughout history to forge, to create these incredibly powerful imagined communities. Now, what's really fascinating here is the contrast. I mean, both nations are building these imagined communities, but their main tools are pretty different. The UK often leans really heavily on nostalgia and heritage, looking back to this sort of idealized traditional past. The USA, on the other hand, well, it frequently uses these big foundational myths and the whole idea of the frontier, a story all about new beginnings and endless possibilities. Let's take a really concrete example. The TV show Downton Abbey. It's just a masterclass in using nostalgia. It's not just telling a story, it's telling a feeling. Academics call this reflexive nostalgia, and it creates this deep longing for a bygone era. But we have to ask the important question. Whose heritage is actually being shown here? This version of Englishness is all about the aristocracy, and it often leaves out the stories of the working class or Britain's colonial history. Okay, now let's hop across the Atlantic. American identity is so deeply rooted in its folklore. I mean, the whole Western genre with its hyper-masculine cowboy totally romanticizes the frontier. But this myth of the tough, rugged individual, well, it pretty much erases the presence of Native Americans, Mexicans, and women from the story. Same thing with stories like Betsy Ross sewing the first flag. They become these powerful national myths. And the key thing to remember is that historical accuracy, it's actually less important than the story's ability to create a shared cultural touchstone, even if it is a selective one. All right, let's get into part two. Because these imagined communities, which were so carefully built over centuries, are now facing some pretty unprecedented pressure. The digital age is fundamentally changing how we share or how we don't share our national stories anymore. This table lays it all out for us perfectly. We're going to look at three key challenges. First, social media algorithms. They're basically eating away at our shared public space. Second, nostalgia is being turned into a political weapon. And third, you've got these powerful counter-narratives rising up from marginalized groups, and they are challenging the official story. So how exactly does social media break up our shared identity? Well, it's a pretty simple four-step process. First, we give it our data. We tell it what we like. In return, the algorithms build a totally personalized world just for us. This creates what we call ideological echo chambers, where we pretty much only see stuff that confirms what we already believe. And the result? The shared space where we can have a national conversation just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And this brings us to political nostalgia. Research shows this really fascinating difference. You see, personal nostalgia, like fond memories of your own childhood, isn't really linked to any specific political view. But national nostalgia, the kind you hear in slogans like "Make America Great Again," shows a really high correlation with support for that movement. It's a totally different and often much more divisive way of looking back at the past. And finally, we have counter-narratives. This quote explains it perfectly. Groups that were left out of the main national story, what we call the hegemonic narrative, are now using things like art, film, and oral history to tell their own marginal memories. And they aren't just adding a new chapter to the story, they are actively challenging and reshaping how we understand the nation's past and present. Just think of movies like Selma or novels like The Underground Railroad. They retell American history from a completely different perspective. Okay, so let's bring all this together and really think about why this whole analysis is so important for you in the AMC framework. Understanding these ideas isn't just some academic exercise, it's absolutely crucial for analyzing the contemporary English-speaking world, and of course, for succeeding in your exams. So let's go all the way back to our guiding question. How do representations shape identity? Here's the most important point to take away. They are not passive mirrors that just reflect a reality that's already there. No, they are active, powerful forces. The stories we tell, the films we watch, the myths we share, they actively construct our sense of who we are. So here are the key takeaways you're definitely going to want to remember for your synthesis or summary tasks. First, the core concept. Nations are imagined into existence through shared stories. Second, the specific tools used in anglophone cultures, like nostalgia and myth. Third, the fragmenting effect of digital media and those echo chambers. And fourth, the growing power of counter-narrative. Now for a super practical exam skill. When you're writing your analysis, I always want you to use the point, example, explanation structure. You see it right here. Let's try it. Your point is your main idea. Downton Abbey constructs an imagined English identity through nostalgia. Simple. Then your example? The show uses sumptuous settings and focuses on a bygone era to create an idealized version of the past. And finally, your explanation. This idealized narrative appeals to a collective memory, reinforcing traditional cultural values of Englishness for a global audience. See? This structure makes sure your analysis is always crystal clear and well supported. And I'll leave you with a final question to think about. As our media becomes more global and way more personalized, the old ways of building an imagined community are really under strain. So what's next? What will be the great stories that bind nations together in the future? Thank you for your attention.